The train was 40 minutes late, and by the time it finally groaned into the station at Wren's Fork, every man who'd finished his business at the feed store had already claimed a spot on the bench out front to watch it come in. There were 7 of them that afternoon, not that anyone was counting, though somebody always was in a town this size. They watched the platform the way men watch anything that breaks up the monotony of a Thursday. She was the last one off. Not because she'd been dragging her feet, though she had. A little, but because she'd spent the last 390 miles building herself into a shape she could hold together once the door opened. And she needed one more lungful of stale train air before she traded it for whatever was waiting on the other side. Her name was Adelaide Marsh. She was 26. Her hair was the color of weak coffee, pinned back in the practical way of a woman who has learned, the hard way, not to invite comment. Her traveling dress was a faded slate blue, mended twice at the cuff, clean despite the dust that clung to everything east of Fort Worth. She carried one bag. She carried it herself. The platform wasn't empty, and neither was the street beyond it. She stood at the edge of the boards and looked down the length of Wren's Fork, Texas, and took the measure of what she'd agreed to. A narrow dirt road, a general store with a sagging awning, a livery at the far end with both doors thrown open to the heat. A sky bleached the color of an old bone left too long in the sun. It hadn't rained in 11 weeks. She didn't need anyone to tell her that. The dust told her. A particular shade of near-white settled over every surface with the patience of something that had no intention of leaving. The ground between the buildings had split in a pattern she'd learned to read later. Shallow hairline cracks near the surface, deeper fissures further out. An entire language written into the dirt by thirst. That was what she was looking at when he crossed the street toward her. He was tall, and he moved without hurrying, which isn't the same thing as moving slowly. He wore a plain work shirt, sleeves shoved past the elbow, and his hat sat pushed back on his head like he'd forgotten it was there rather than arranged it that way on purpose. He had the look of a man who'd spent most of his adult life outdoors and had stopped noticing. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way you'd look at something you were trying to size up correctly. She looked back the same way. "Ma'am," he said, not quite a question. More an acknowledgement that she was standing there and that he was the one who'd come for her. "Yes," she said. He reached for her bag. She didn't let go right away, not refusing exactly, just still deciding. His hand closed over the handle, hers stayed on the strap, and for a beat that ran a little too long, neither of them moved. Then she let go. "Wagons at the livery," he said. She followed him off the platform and into the pale dust of Wren's Fork, and behind her, from the bench outside the feed store, she heard the low hum of 7 men finding something new to talk about. "If you're just joining me, I'm going to walk you through something that started with a mail-order bride and a broken-down wagon wheel, and ended up being about a lot more than either one. Stick around, because there's a turn in this story about halfway through that changes everything you think you understand about why she really came west." The wagon was a working man's wagon. No cushion on the bench, no paint left on the side panels. A water barrel lashed to the back with rope that had been knotted and reknotted so many times the knots had grown knots of their own. She climbed up without waiting for a hand. He noticed that. He walked around to the other side, climbed up himself, and took the reins, and they left Wren's Fork without a word passing between them. The land opened up fast. One moment there were storefronts and a dog asleep in a doorway and the ring of a hammer from the smithy. And then there was nothing but flat earth and white sky, and a road pressing west through. Grass gone the color of old rope. She could see the drought written into the margins of the road. Long dry seams where the ground had tried to split itself open and let something out. He drove and didn't look at her, and she was grateful for it. She'd been braced for questions, or worse, that particular brand of polite attention that's really just an inspection wearing manners. He gave her neither. He watched the road. He corrected the reins when one of the horses pulled left. He was easy in the silence the way a person is easy in a room they've lived in a long time. After a while she said, "How far is it?" "1.5 hours," he said. "Maybe 2 if that back wheel wants to give me grief again." She looked at the wheel. It had a wobble to it, slight but steady, like a sentence with one wrong word buried in it. "It's given you trouble before, twice this month. You know what's wrong with it?" "Yes," she waited. "Haven't had the time to fix it." He said it flat, no apology in it, just weather. Just fact, she let that sit and looked back at the road. Grass on both sides, brittle and short, sky above it a pale, merciless blue. Far off, so far it might have been her imagination, a line of something darker sat along the horizon. Cloud, maybe, or just haze pretending. She'd left Missouri 4 days earlier with one trunk, and a sewing basket her mother had pressed into her hands the winter before she died. The basket was in the trunk, and the trunk was in the wagon bed, and she hadn't looked at it once since the porter loaded it back in St. Louis. She didn't look at it now, either. She looked at the cracked earth instead, at the long, pale lines running out from the road's edge. She was already thinking about water. The town of Rutledge's Bend showed up sooner than she expected. One moment there was only road and brittle grass, and then the wagon crested a low rise, and there it was. A main street with maybe 8 buildings on it, a water tower standing at the far end, a church with no steeple. The wood on most storefronts had gone gray from years of sun. A dog trotted across the near end of the street and vanished between 2 buildings without so much as a glance. He drove down the center of it, and she sat straight and kept her chin level. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store stopped mid-stroke. A man in the livery doorway froze with his hand half raised. 2 children on a step stared with the particular focus children reserve for things they've been told not to stare at. She'd expected the watching. There'd been watching at every stop since St. Louis, at the platform in Kansas City, at the way station outside Abilene, where she'd eaten cold bread across from a couple who kept glancing at her satchel like it might explain her. Being looked at didn't cost her anything. She decided that a long time before this. He pulled up in front of a narrow building with a hardware sign weathered nearly blank. He set the brake and got down without ceremony, and she got down herself before he could come around. He didn't remark on it. He lifted her trunk from the wagon bed without asking if she wanted help, which was different from presuming, and carried it to the door, unlocked it, and carried it through. She followed with the sewing basket. Inside it was dim, smelling of sawdust and iron and something older underneath, the smell of a room that had been worked hard for a long time. A counter ran along the left wall with empty shelves behind it. Through a doorway at the back she could see a table, 2 chairs, a window with the shade drawn. He set the trunk against the wall. "There's a room through the back. It'd be yours alone." She looked at the yellowed edge of the shade. "And the arrangement. Advertisement said a farm, house, and 55 acres. 3 miles east. Who's been working it? No one, not since last spring." She set the sewing basket on the counter. "Show me tomorrow," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not measuring her, not unkind about it either. The way a man looks at a door he isn't sure will hold his weight. "All right," he said, and went out to see to the horse, and she stood alone in the dim room while, through the window, the pale sky began very slowly to bruise orange. She slept in her clothes. Not from exhaustion, though there was plenty of that, from habit. The habit of a woman who'd spent 2 months in places where sleeping unguarded could go badly, and who hadn't yet decided whether this was one of them. The room was small, a cot, a washstand, a hook on the wall holding a coil of old rope for a purpose she couldn't guess. The window faced east. When morning came, it came all at once, flat and white and without apology. She was up before it fully arrived. She found the pump in the yard and washed her face and hands, the water cold enough to catch her breath, and dried on her sleeve. No one else was awake on the street yet, just a dog moving nose down along the far boardwalk, and somewhere past the livery, a rooster losing an argument with the morning. Back inside, she opened the sewing basket and took stock. Needles, 3 cards of thread, black-brown, a blue gone pale with age, a small pair of shears. A folded square of cloth she'd been meaning to hem for 2 months, everything present. She heard him before she saw him, not footsteps, but the sound of the pump handle working, the same catch of cold water she'd felt an hour before. Then boots on the back step. He came in with his hair still damp, a cup in each hand. He set one on the counter beside her without asking if she wanted it, and didn't remark on the fact that she was already dressed and had apparently reorganized her whole life in the night. He crossed to the window with the second cup and looked out at the street. She picked hers up. When did it last rain? March, early March. She did the arithmetic, late July now. And before that, fall wasn't much even then. She held the cup in both hands. The coffee had a weight to it strong enough to argue with. Is the well good, so far? The 55 acres, what's the soil? He turned from the window then, not because the question startled him, but because he wanted to answer it honestly. And that meant looking at her while he did it. Clay underneath, some topsoil left in the lower quarter, rest of it's gone to crust. She nodded once. I want to see the lower quarter first. Something shifted in his face, small, hard to name. Not quite relief, more like the recognition that a thing he'd braced for might not turn out to be difficult after all. He drained his cup. Horse'll be ready in an hour. She turned back to her basket. I'll be here. Before we go any further, where are you watching this from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing how far this story travels. Now, back to the field that was about to change both their lives. The lower quarter sat at the far end of the property, where the land tipped slightly north, and whatever runoff there was in the wet months gathered into something that could briefly be called promise. She rode behind him on the buckboard without talking. The road was pale, fine dust from the gate clear to the far fence line, rising around the wheels and settling on everything it touched. The sky sat white at its edges, not clouded, just worn thin. He stopped the horse at the slope's edge and they both looked down. The lower quarter was brown, but a different brown than the rest of the property, where the upper fields had gone the color of old brick, cracking at the surface. This ground held something darker underneath, something still waiting. A few stubborn weeds clung to the fence post nearest the dry creek bed. She noted them and said nothing. She climbed down before he could offer a hand. She walked to the center of the section, crouched, and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. It resisted at the top and gave underneath. She pushed deeper. When she pulled her hand back, a bit of earth clung to her fingers, and she rubbed it between thumb and forefinger, studying what it left behind. He'd stayed with the horse. She walked the perimeter without rushing, stopping twice, once near the creek bed, once at the northeast corner where something had grown up and gone to dry stalk. She bent and snapped the stalk at its base and looked at the root. When she came back, her fingers were still dark. There's moisture 3 inches down, she said. He said nothing. How far does the creek bed run before it hits the main channel? 1/4 mile, maybe a little less. She looked toward it. If it rained 2 inches over the next month, would it run? 1.5 inches would do it, she nodded slowly. The soil's not gone. It's just been left to seal shut. She wiped her hand against her skirt. Break the crust before the rain comes and you give the water somewhere to go once it lands. He looked out at the field. That assumes the rain comes. It comes, she said, without a trace of sentiment, the way a person states a thing they've watched happen enough times that opinion no longer factors into it. It always comes eventually. He turned to study her. She was still watching the field. The upper sections, any of them fallow. Northwest 20. How long? 2 seasons. She was already climbing back onto the buckboard. I'd like to see that one before we head in. He offered his hand for the step up. She took it that time. The Northwest 20 sat higher, where the land lifted before flattening toward the ridge. The soil there ran lighter, not the exhausted pale of the crusted ground, but the gray tan of dirt that had simply been resting. No crust here, the wind had kept it loose. She was down before the buckboard had fully stopped. He watched her walk the edge of it, her hem dragging up fine dust, stopping every 10 feet or so to crouch and pull up a handful, letting it sift through her fingers each time. He stayed with the horse. After the 4th stop, she straightened and looked back at him. This ground would take seed. It's too dry to germinate anything. It's dry on top. She crouched again, pressed her palm flat, and pushed. There's give underneath. A 1/2 inch of rain doesn't plant a crop. No, she stood. But it starts one. He got down and walked over and crouched the way she had, pressing his own palm to the dirt. Not moisture exactly, but the absence of the rigid hardness that lived in the lower fields. Some latency in it, something waiting to be asked. He stayed crouched a moment longer than he needed to. You've worked ground like this before. It wasn't quite a question. My father farmed dry land in Kansas, she said. Before it went the same way this has, she paused. We planted the fallow sections last. By the time we got to them, we'd already learned what worked. Did it work? She looked at the field instead of at him. Enough of it did. He stood, and the afternoon light had gone long and flat, the kind that makes distance hard to trust. The ridge looked closer than it was. The disc harrow's blade is cracked, he said. Can it be welded? Needs a new tooth, weld won't hold. How long to get one? Fremont's might have the part. Otherwise, I'd have to send off to Abilene. He looked up, doing the arithmetic men do when they're weighing sky against calendar. 10 days if I'm lucky. She nodded, still watching the field. There was something in the set of her, not impatience, not quite satisfaction either. More like a person who's already calculated 3 moves ahead and is simply waiting for the present to catch up to her. Lower sections first, then, she said. Break the crust there. Give it a head start before any rain hits. She turned toward the buckboard. By the time you have the tooth, this ground will still be here waiting on us. He picked up the reins. We'll head back. She climbed up without the offered hand this time. He noticed. He said nothing about that either. The ride home was quiet the way work makes things quiet, not empty, but used up. The horse kept its own pace and neither of them pushed it. She watched the land slide by, the sections they'd covered that morning lying dark and turned behind them against the pale, untouched ground, so that from above, if anyone had been up there to see it, it would have looked like a hem being let down, the edge of something new just starting to show through. He stopped at Fremont's on the way through Rutledge's Bend. She waited on the wagon seat. A woman by the mercantile glanced over once and away again, the way people do when they've already made up their mind about what they're looking at. Adelaide sat level and let her. He was out again in 4 minutes, climbed up, gathered the reins, and didn't speak until they'd cleared the last building. He thinks he can have the tooth by Thursday. Thursday was 6 days out. She did the arithmetic the same way he had not counted felt. Good, she said. At the house she went in ahead of him. The kitchen still held the weight of noon heat. She crossed to the window over the basin and threw it open. And the air that came through smelled of dry grass with something faint and green underneath it. So faint she wasn't sure she hadn't invented it. She got the stove going. He came in behind her, stood in the doorway a beat longer than usual, then crossed to the table and sat with his hat still on. She took 2 cups down from the shelf. He didn't take the hat off until she set the coffee in front of him, and then he set it on the table beside his cup, brim down. They didn't talk through most of it. She stood at the window with her cup. He sat with his, and the silence between them had a weight to it, not comfortable, not uncomfortable. Present the way weather is present. You know this kind of ground? He said finally. She turned just enough to answer without fully facing him. My father farmed clay west of the Brazos. Ground like this breaks your heart before it ever gives you a thing. He was quiet. But it gives, she said. That's the whole trick of it, once it decides to. She said it to the window. He didn't answer, and she hadn't expected him to. Later, with supper done and the dishes cleared, she found him out on the porch with the battered notebook he kept his field records in, writing something she didn't try to read. She went back inside and left him to it. Though she could see the lamplight through the window, his shadow bent over the page. She sat at the table, put her hands flat on the wood, looked at them a moment, then reached for her mending. Now here's the part I think you're going to want to see coming and probably won't. Because 3 days later, something happened that neither of them planned, and it changed the entire shape of what this arrangement actually was. 3 days after that conversation, she found the notebook lying open on the table, not left carelessly, set there, turned to a particular page. She knew the difference between an accident and an invitation. She stood in the kitchen with her hands still damp from the morning wash and looked at it without touching it. The page held a rough sketch, field lines, contour marks, a column of figures running down the margin. She recognized the shape of it as the south field, the low corners he'd plowed twice already for nothing. She didn't sit down. She read it standing, the way you read something you might need to set aside fast. He'd written measurements she recognized, furrow spacing, a rough estimate of the slope's grade, and below that in a different ink pressed harder than the rest, a single line. Breaks your heart before it gives you anything, her words. He'd written her own words into his field records like they belonged there. She heard him coming in from the barn and didn't move from where she stood. He came into the kitchen, saw her over the notebook, and didn't say anything about it. He crossed to the basin and washed his hands, and she listened to the water running. I've been thinking about the drainage, she said. I know. If you cut a shallow channel here, she pointed to the low corner without touching the book, and run it northeast toward the back fence line. The water has somewhere to go when the heavy rains come. It stopped sitting. He dried his hands, came to stand beside her close enough that she could hear him breathe, and studied the page. That's rocky ground up that way, 4-5 inches down. After that it's soft as a coffin lid. He went quiet a moment. You've walked that fence line? Last week. He looked back at the sketch, his eyes moving over it the way a man's eyes move over ground he's responsible for slow. With the kind of attention that costs something. Grade would have to carry it the whole way. It will. I walked it twice. He nodded once, not quite agreement, more like a door easing open an inch. He pulled out the chair and sat. She stayed standing, and for a few minutes neither of them said a word, just looked at the page. Then he picked up the pencil and drew a faint line where she'd indicated, following the land the way she'd described it. She watched his hand. The line was tentative, the mark of a man not yet certain, but willing to start. She reached over and nudged it a degree, maybe two, to where the grade would carry better. Her finger touched the paper right at the edge of where his pencil had stopped. He looked at where she'd pointed and redrew the line. They worked like that for the better part of an hour. She brought out her second sketch, the one of the lower field where the clay ran hard and the water pooled instead of moving. He studied that one longer than the first. She let the silence sit. 2 channels, he said finally. Not one, she'd only drawn one. She looked at his reasoning and saw it at once. A single channel would slow before it reached the field's end and back up come wet season. 2, she agreed. He made a mark. She adjusted it a fraction. He looked at her correction and made another, folding in what she'd changed. It went on like that, a conversation neither of them was speaking aloud. The lamp burned lower. She got up without asking and trimmed the wick, and the light steadied, and he watched her do it the way a man watches something efficient and doesn't comment. Because commenting would only shrink it. By the time they finished, the table held 4 pages, her original sketches, his additions. Pencil lines crossing and reinforcing each other, until you couldn't have said whose thinking belonged to whom. He sat back, hands flat on the table, pencil caught between 2 fingers. It'll take most of the summer. Yes, we'll need to borrow the Hargrove boys' team for the heavy cuts. I know. He looked at her then, not the quick. Redirected glance he used when he caught himself watching her too long, but a direct one. Steady, she met it. You knew all this before you ever drew it, he said. She didn't answer right away. Outside, something shifted in the wind, a cedar branch maybe brushing the eave. I knew enough, she said. I needed to know if you'd look. He held her gaze a moment longer, then dropped it to the pages. She understood it wasn't deflection. It was something he needed to do, returning to the practical, to the ground underneath the feeling. Because the feeling had gotten larger than the room could comfortably hold, and they were both still learning its size. She didn't push past it. She gathered the sketches, held them to her chest. I'll make a clean copy tomorrow. In case rain gets in and blurs these. They won't blur. They might. Then make a clean copy, she almost smiled. She turned to set the pages on the shelf, and he didn't move. But she felt his attention on her back the way you feel weather coming. Not a threat exactly, not warmth exactly either. Just a change in the pressure of the air between 2 people. She set the pages beneath the window. The lamp burned on behind her. The rain came 3 days later. Not the false kind that blows through in 10 minutes and leaves the ground harder than it found it. This was different. It arrived before dawn, quiet at first, tapping the glass the way a careful person knocks before letting themselves in. She lay still and listened to it build. By the time the sky was pale enough to see by, it was coming down steady and unhurried, and the smell working under the door was the smell of the earth finally opening its hand. She rose before he did. She took the sketches down from the shelf and set them on the table in the gray morning light, the channel she'd drawn, the low berm along the eastern edge. The way the slope could be read if a person trusted the ground to show them where the water wanted to go. She heard him in the lean-to pulling on his boots. When he came through, he stopped at the window first, one hand on the frame, watching the rain come down across the field. She couldn't see his face. She didn't need to. It's holding, he said. It is. He turned and looked at the sketches on the table, came to stand beside her. Close enough that she was aware of the narrow space between their shoulders. Aware of it the way you're aware of standing near the edge of something. The berm, he said, If we get to it before the ground softens too far. Today, he nodded, already running the sequence in his head. She could tell the order things needed to happen in. That was how he worked through a problem, not outward but inward toward the shape of the thing itself. She'd learned to read that as attention, not distance. She went to put the coffee on. He was already out the door by the time it had brewed, moving across the wet ground toward the eastern edge of the field. She watched him from the doorway, cup in both hands. The rain had eased to something fine, and even, the light coming up slow behind low clouds. He stopped at the spot she'd marked, the lowest point of the natural grade, where water would gather if it ever had somewhere to gather to. He stood looking at the ground the way he looked at things he was about to commit to, still, reading something she couldn't make out from the porch. She set her cup down, went in, pulled on her boots. When she came back out, she took the second spade from where it leaned against the fence post and crossed the wet grass toward him without calling out. He heard her coming before he turned. The sound of boots on soaked ground, the particular rhythm of her step by now familiar. He didn't look around. She came to stand at his left, the spade handle resting against her shoulder, and looked at what he was looking at, a darker patch of ground worn smooth by years of rain, finding the same low path and going nowhere. She'd marked it right. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. It gave soft the whole way through, and when he drew his hand back, the print held its shape. She crouched beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, quiet more to himself than to her, 8 feet to the rock shelf, maybe 10. She looked at where the grade fell south. If the channel runs the low side here and bends at the fence line, gravity does the rest of the work. He stood, she stood. He paced 4 steps south, stopped, turned back toward the house, then the sky, then the field, reading the land the way she'd read her own sketch, not looking for what he wanted to find, but for what was actually there. He came back, picked up the second spade from where she'd left it, standing upright in the soft dirt. They started at the notch she'd cut in the grass the evening before with a stick still visible despite the rain. He broke the first sod, she broke the second. They moved south along the grade in a steady, alternating rhythm neither of them had planned, that simply found itself after the first few minutes. The rain kept on, fine and even, cooling the work without chilling it. After a while she noticed they'd stopped being 2 people laboring near each other, and had become something closer to one motion, turning at the same intervals, pausing at the same moments to check the line they were cutting. She didn't remark on it, she kept working. The light rose slowly. The clouds held but thinned east, and the air shifted from gray toward something closer to pale gold. He stopped. She stopped half a second behind him. He was looking at the trench they'd cut 15 feet, still shallow but true to the grade. Rainwater was already finding the low point of it and settling there, waiting. She watched it too. "It'll hold," he said. She didn't answer. She was already sighting the next section, working out the bend in her head. They cut the bend together, adjusting the angle twice before it sat right. The water would need somewhere to turn without losing its momentum. And getting that wrong would undo every foot of work behind it. He watched how she read the ground, not guessing at it, but following something she could see, and he had to take on faith until the water proved her right. The flow gathered in the elbow of the trench and moved on south, exactly as it should. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped. The clouds sat flat and pale, and the air had that particular stillness that only follows weather. They worked another hour in the quiet, extending the line toward the lower field where the corn had come in thin 2 seasons running. They barely spoke. When they needed to coordinate, it was a short word, or no word at all, a gesture, a tilt of the chin, a pause the other read correctly and matched. He drove the last stake himself. She stood back and took in the full length of what they'd cut 40 feet of shallow trench, true to the grade, already dark with held water along its floor. "Give it 1 dry week," she said, "and we'll see." He nodded. They walked back toward the house together, tools over their shoulders, boots heavy with mud. The boy was at the window. He'd been there most of the morning. Thomas's younger brother, 12 years old, left in his care after their parents passed. Quiet in the particular way of a child who understands something is happening, he'll remember for the rest of his life. He didn't wave, he just watched them come. She set her tools against the porch rail and sat on the step to pull off her boots. He did the same beside her. For a moment they sat side by side in the gray morning light. not talking, looking out at a field where the trench had already vanished into the ordinary brown of the earth, flat enough. Shallow enough that you'd never know it was there unless you already knew where to look. She knew she could trace the line of it in her mind with total precision. He set his hand flat on the step between them, not reaching, not asking, just there on the worn wood near her own hand. She looked at it a moment, then she set her hand on top of his. Neither of them said a word. The clouds moved on overhead. Somewhere behind the house, the chickens had started up again, ordinary and indifferent to everything that had just happened in the dirt below the eastern field. The boy was still at the window. That was all it took. In 3 weeks, the lower field showed green further south than it ever had in living memory. By harvest, the trench had been extended twice, once by him, once by her, while he was out mending fence on the north end. They never planned it that way. It just happened, the way most things between them had started happening by then, not decided exactly. Just true, the way water is true to grade, once somebody's finally willing to cut the path and let it find its own way home. If you'd been standing where she was standing that first day on the platform, dust in your throat, and a whole life packed into one trunk you hadn't opened since St. Louis, would you have stayed? Would you have trusted a stranger's silence the way she did, or would you have turned around and gotten back on that train? Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and tell me what you would have done in her place. If this one got you, hit like, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next story.